The park was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that only came with the first light of dawn. Frost clung to the grass in delicate webs, and a few determined pigeons pecked at the icy ground in search of breakfast. On a weathered bench near the fountain, Mr. George sat hunched against the chill, his breath puffing in white clouds. His coat was frayed at the cuffs, the faded olive color a ghost of its former life as an army jacket. With deliberate care, George tore off a small piece of bread from a crumpled loaf in his lap. He tossed it onto the ground, watching as the pigeons scrambled for it. His hands were rough, calloused, and scarred, a road map of a life etched in hard work and harder battles. He chewed his own meager portion slowly, savoring it despite its staleness. "Morning, George," a voice rasped. George turned to see Jimmy, a wiry man in his 40s with sunken cheeks and a perpetual slouch, shuffling toward him. Jimmy's shoes were mismatched, his coat too thin for the season. "Morning, Jimmy," George replied, his voice gravelly but warm. He broke off a larger piece of bread and handed it over without hesitation. Jimmy sat beside him, the bench creaking under their weight. "You always sharing, old man," Jimmy said, though he took the bread eagerly. "You're gonna go hungry one of these days." George gave a faint smile, his gray mustache twitching. "A little less for me means a little more for someone else," he said. "That's how it works, Jimmy. We all gotta get through this together." The two men ate in companionable silence for a while, their breath mingling in the cold air. As the sun climbed higher, the park began to stir. Joggers passed by without sparing them a glance. A young woman walking her dog cast a nervous glance in their direction before quickening her pace. George noticed, but he didn't let it bother him. "Got any plans today?" Jimmy asked, finishing his bread. George shrugged. "Same as always. See who needs help, maybe scrape together enough for lunch." "You?" Jimmy chuckled bitterly. "Same, I guess. Not much else to do." George patted Jimmy on the shoulder as he rose from the bench. His knees protested, but he ignored the ache. "Keep your chin up, Jimmy. We've seen worse, haven't we?" Jimmy nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, we have." George adjusted his coat and started down the path, his gait slow but steady. The pigeons followed for a few steps before losing interest. As he walked, George scanned the park with the practiced eye of someone who understood the hidden struggles of the world. His day was just beginning, and there were people out there who needed him. And for George, that was reason enough to keep going. The cold gnawed at George's bones as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows over the narrow alleyways. He pulled his coat tighter around him as he shuffled down a familiar route, his steps echoing faintly against the brick walls. It was then he saw them, a woman and a child, huddled together in a corner, their faces pale with exhaustion. The woman's arms were wrapped protectively around the boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. The boy's thin jacket and torn sneakers did little to shield him from the biting wind. George hesitated for only a moment before approaching, his voice gentle. "You folks okay?" The woman flinched but then relaxed slightly when she saw the concern in his eyes. "We're fine," she murmured, though her shivering hands told a different story. George knelt, lowering himself to their level. He reached into his coat and pulled out his blanket, worn but warm, and draped it over their shoulders. "Here, this'll help a bit." The woman's eyes widened. "No, we can't take that." "What about you?" George shook his head with a soft smile. "I've been through worse, ma'am. You keep that for your boy." The boy peeked out from under the blanket, his big brown eyes full of curiosity. "Are you a soldier?" he asked, pointing at the faded patches on George's coat. "Used to be," George said, ruffling the boy's hair. "A long time ago." The woman's voice cracked as she spoke. "Thank you. I don't know how we'll get through tonight. There's a shelter not far from here," George said, pointing down the street. "Run by a good bunch. They'll take care of you." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're very kind." George tipped his cap and stood. "Kindness is what keeps us going. You take care now." As he walked away, the boy's small voice called after him. "Thank you, mister." George smiled but didn't turn around. The wind seemed a little less cold as he continued on his way. The memorial stood quiet and solemn in the pale morning light, a row of black granite slabs engraved with the names of the fallen. George stood before it, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes roamed over the endless list. His fingers traced a familiar name, Private James Turner. The name brought a flood of memories, a young man with a crooked grin and a knack for making everyone laugh, even in the darkest moments. George could almost hear his voice again, cracking jokes in the humid jungles of Vietnam. They didn't deserve to go, George muttered to himself, his voice trembling. He took off his cap, pressing it to his chest as he bowed his head. The weight of guilt and grief pressed against him, as heavy as it had been the day he returned home. The silence of the memorial was a stark contrast to the chaos he had lived through, and yet the battle inside him still raged. He closed his eyes, whispering a promise he had made decades ago. I'll keep going. For you, and for everyone else who didn't make it back. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying the faint scent of spring. George slipped his cap back on and straightened his shoulders. He walked away slowly, the sound of his footsteps fading into the stillness, but his resolve burned a little brighter. Underneath the old railway bridge, George set down the bag of bread he managed to gather from a local bakery's leftovers. A small group of familiar faces began to gather, drawn by the smell of food and the warmth of companionship. All right, folks, George said, clapping his hands together. Let's see what we've got here. Jimmy and Marcus, a scrappy teenager with sharp eyes, helped distribute the bread. They tore it into pieces to make sure everyone got a share. The group wasn't large, maybe 8 or 9 people, but each face bore the same weary expression, the same hope for a better day. As they ate, George spoke, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had once led others through impossible situations. You know, back in the army, we had a saying, we all make it, or none of us do. That's how we got through the toughest times. By sticking together. Marcus nodded, chewing on a piece of bread. Sounds like you were a leader back then, George. George chuckled. Not by choice, kid. But sometimes life throws you into it, and you just do what you can. The group murmured in agreement. For a moment, the tension in the air eased, replaced by the warmth of shared understanding. Linda, the woman George had helped earlier, approached with her son. She held a small bundle wrapped in foil. I wanted to thank you, George, she said. It's not much, but we brought some soup to share. The group gratefully accepted the offering, and George smiled at Linda. You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you did. That's how it starts, one small thing at a time. As the sun began to set, the group sat together under the bridge, sharing stories, laughter, and hope. George looked around at the faces illuminated by the warm glow of a makeshift lantern. For a moment, the world didn't seem so harsh, and the burden of his own struggles felt a little lighter. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting the alley in near darkness. The faint glow of a distant street lamp barely illuminated the crumbling brick walls and scattered trash. George was making his way back to his usual spot when he heard raised voices echoing through the narrow passage ahead. Hand it over, kid! A rough voice barked. No! It's mine! Came a panicked reply. George quickened his pace, his heart pounding. As he turned the corner, he saw a teenage boy, Marcus, pinned against the wall by a man twice his size. The man was yanking at Marcus's backpack, his face twisted in anger. Hey! George shouted, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. The man froze and turned to see George, his silhouette imposing despite his age. This ain't your business, old man, the man growled. George took a step closer, his gaze steady and unyielding. Let the boy go. Now. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between George and Marcus. Something in George's posture, his quiet authority, the way he stood firm despite his frail appearance, made the man release his grip. Fine. Whatever. The man muttered before slinking away into the shadows. Marcus slumped to the ground, clutching his backpack tightly. George knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You all right, kid? Marcus nodded, his voice shaky. Yeah, thanks, George. I didn't know what to do. You did the best you could, George said, helping him to his feet. Next time, call out. We're here for each other, remember? Marcus gave a small smile, his trust in George deepening. Together they walked back to the group, the night feeling a little less dangerous. The group gathered under the old railway bridge, armed with brooms, trash bags, and a shared determination. George had rallied them earlier that morning, pointing out the mess that had accumulated in their little corner of the city. If we're gonna call this home, even for now, he said, let's make it a place worth living in. At first there were groans and grumbles, but soon everyone was pitching in. Jimmy hauled a pile of discarded cardboard into a trash bag, while Marcus scrubbed graffiti off a nearby wall. Even Linda's young son helped, collecting empty cans and bottles in his small hands. George worked alongside them, his weathered hands steady as he repaired a broken bench with a piece of scrap wood he'd found. Sweat beaded on his brow, but there was a lightness in his movements, a sense of purpose that energized him. By the time the sun began to set, their little corner looked transformed. The trash was gone, the graffiti cleaned up, and the space felt brighter, even under the dim glow of the streetlights. Linda approached George with a smile. You've got a way of bringing people together, George. George chuckled. Just showing folks what they're capable of. That's all. That evening, Linda returned with a small pot of stew she'd made using donated ingredients. The group shared the meal, their laughter echoing off the bridge's steel beams. For the first time in a long while, hope felt tangible, like something they could hold on to. The storm hit harder than anyone had expected. Bitter winds howled through the city, driving icy rain into every crevice. George and the others huddled under the bridge, their makeshift shelter of tarps and blankets no match for the relentless downpour. By morning, the damage was clear. Their sleeping areas were soaked, their meager supplies ruined. Jimmy cursed under his breath, his frustration echoing everyone's despair. What do we do now, George? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of the dripping rain. George stared at the wreckage, his shoulders heavy with the weight of their collective loss. For a moment he felt the creeping tendrils of hopelessness. The memories of war surged forward unbidden, nights spent in the jungle, drenched and cold, with no guarantee of survival. He sat down by the remnants of their fire pit, staring into the ash. His mind drifted to the faces of his comrades, men who had leaned on each other during the darkest hours. Their voices echoed in his memory, urging him not to give in. After a long silence, George finally spoke. We rebuild, he said firmly. His voice carried a quiet strength that silenced the group. We've made it through worse. Together, we'll get through this too. Jimmy nodded, his earlier anger melting into resolve. Marcus picked up a piece of wood and began clearing debris. One by one, the others joined in, their spirits rekindled by George's unwavering determination. As they worked to rebuild their shelter, George felt a flicker of pride. The storm had tested them, but it hadn't broken them. For him, that was victory enough. A crisp morning sun broke through the clouds as George sat by the bridge, inspecting a torn tarp he planned to patch. The night had been quieter than usual, and he welcomed the rare moment of peace. A woman approached, her scarf pulled tight against the chill. She carried a camera slung over her shoulder and a notebook tucked under her arm. George watched her cautiously as she stopped a few feet away, her expression open and curious. Mr. George, is it? She asked, her voice warm but professional. He straightened, a hint of wariness in his eyes. Depends who's asking. My name's Sarah. I'm a journalist, she said, extending a hand. I've been hearing about the work you're doing here, helping others. I'd love to tell your story. George hesitated, glancing at the others. Jimmy gave him a shrug, while Marcus nodded enthusiastically. You deserve some credit, George, the boy said. After a moment, George sighed and gestured to the makeshift seating they'd set up. All right. But it's not just me. This is all of us, working together. Sarah spent the morning listening to George and the others, jotting down notes and snapping photos. She asked about his time in the army, his struggles after returning home, and the way he'd built this little community. George spoke humbly, emphasizing the importance of helping one another. A week later, the article went live. Titled "The Homeless Hero: One Man's Mission to Help the Forgotten." It painted a vivid picture of George's quiet leadership and the group's resilience. Donations began trickling in: blankets, food, even small amounts of money. For the first time in years, George saw a glimmer of hope for something better. The bridge buzzed with activity as supplies piled up. Linda sorted through boxes of canned food while Jimmy organized donated clothes into neat stacks. Even Marcus had a job, helping distribute new sleeping bags to those in need. "Feels like Christmas," Jimmy joked, holding up a thick winter coat. George stood to the side, watching with a mix of pride and gratitude. He hadn't sought recognition, but the outpouring of support reminded him of the goodness still present in the world. As the day wore on, a young man approached, holding a small box. He looked out of place in his crisp jacket and polished shoes. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "Are you Mr. George?" George nodded. "That's me. What can I do for you?" The man swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "My father was a Vietnam veteran. He didn't make it home. When I read your story, it reminded me of him. I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done, for the people here, and for the sacrifices you made back then." He handed George the box. Inside was a neatly folded American flag and a small note that simply read, "For your service and your heart." George's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Finally, he managed a quiet, "Thank you, son. That means more than I can say." The young man smiled and left, but the weight of his words lingered, filling George with a deep sense of purpose. The weeks turned into months, and under George's quiet guidance, the community grew stronger. Their little corner under the bridge became a refuge not just for themselves, but for others in need. Marcus, inspired by George, began organizing efforts to help nearby homeless camps. He'd grown into a confident young leader, his sharp eyes now filled with determination. "I'm just following your example, George," he said one evening, after returning from a supply run. George chuckled, the lines on his face softening. "You're doing more than I ever could, kid. Keep it up." One crisp evening, the group gathered around a small fire. Linda's son laughed as Jimmy told one of his outlandish stories, and the aroma of stew filled the air. George sat back, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Linda turned to him, smiling warmly. "You've created something special here, George. You've given people hope." George shook his head humbly. "It wasn't just me. We all did this, together." As the fire crackled and the conversation continued, George felt a deep peace settle over him. His life hadn't been easy, but he had found a way to make it meaningful. The stars glittered above as the group shared their meal, their laughter carrying into the night. George looked up at the sky, his heart full. He knew that the flame of kindness he had ignited would burn long after he was gone. In the quiet of the night, one thought lingered in his mind: giving is forever.